congratulations on the BEM, British Empire Medal, but also you did a degree, didn't you, when you were 87? In?
Well, I did it in several subjects. I did it basically at Cardiff University Lifelong Learning, first of all in Spanish and creative writing, and then I finished it at the Open University and in sociolinguistics, but that gave me my 300 points. But then they said, oh, but you've only done 60 with us, you've got to do 100. And so I had to do another 40. So I did a 2-week course at Bath University at a summer school in philosophy, level 3, and I did the extra 30 in the perspectives of complementary and alternative medicines. So it's a bit of a mixed open degree.
I bet if Steven Spielberg gets hold of that, it'll be a film, won't it? So really and truly, it's an example, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen, that if you are feeling in your 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, of like slowing down, if you do want your blood to keep flowing to the Commonwealth regions of your body, here's an example. Just keep flowing, keep busy, and then, of course, success will come your way. Age really doesn't matter. Age, of course, is relative. I discovered new maths fairly recently. If all the past years had been 15 months, not 12, when you get to 60, you're actually 48. And when you get to 75, you're actually 56. So you can work on that basis as well. Now, Eileen, where are you from originally?
I was born in Islington and brought up in Winchmore Hill, North London.
And now synonymous with Sully?
Yeah, I've been in Sully longer than I've been anywhere else, I think.
And your maiden name?
My maiden name was Le Croisette.
See, quality, isn't it? Right. Right.
We were a Huguenot family that came over in about 1690 after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. I wasn't there then. I came along later.
Yes, yes. And then, having married, we'll come back to marriage a little later, but the name Younghusband, it's not as simplistic as it sounds, is it?
No, not at all. No, the name Younghusband isn't that at all. A long, long time ago, when the Saxons invaded Northumbria, there was a man called King Ira, who became king of a little area there, and he had a son called Osban. And when Osban became king, he had a son who was called Young Osban.
So Younghusband.
And so Younghusband is an adulteration of Young Osban.
I can't claim anything like that, but we nobles apparently came in with William the Conqueror.
Oh, well, sorry.
However,
you beat me there.
No, I don't beat you at all, because there were two kinds of nobles. There was the noble knight who sat on his charger with his lance in one hand, his shield in the other, and his visor coming down over his nose. And then there were the noble's men who held his horse and cleaned up after him. And that's us.
Oh.
We are the serfs of that, from Suffolk originally,
oh, right.
Oddly enough, before we came around the coast. Now, early life, we'll bounce around to the two sort of productions we've got here, because now your first book was in 2009, wasn't it?
Yes.
And it was entitled?
Not an Ordinary Life.
Not an Ordinary Life. And then it was One Woman's War 2 years later.
That's right.
And now then, you mentioned men, of course, in the third one. Let's pick one straight away out.
Right.
When in your education, there was a headmaster who was instrumental in setting you on a course.
Yes, his name was Thomas Everard, M-R-A-M-L-R-C-M, so he was a great musician as well. And I was at a grammar school, and in those days, you either left school at 14 or you left school at 16. And when I took the scholarship, the very first day, Mr. Everard came in and he said, "We don't have a first form in this school. We go straight into the second form. You will take matriculation in 4 years." And I was barely 15 when I took it. And he said, "Because then I will have 1 year to begin your education." And we could then choose commerce, science, or arts, and I chose commerce, and I learnt skills that have kept me going all my life. Bookkeeping and accountancy to balance sheet before I was 16 years old. Commercial French, commercial German. I did shorthand up to 140 words a minute. typing 60 words a minute, also economics, all sorts of things that have been useful wherever I've been.
But there was a certain pedigree, wasn't there? Because I would say that your father was a craftsman, but your mother was the mathematician.
Yes. My mother worked in the counting house. The counting house in New Bond Street of a female shop, a shop for fashion, but run by women, which was popular in the time of the suffragettes, because every other window of the shops were broken by the suffragettes, and the window of her shop remained entire.
When you got to 16 and then it became working age, as it were, it didn't last long. You weren't terribly happy. Was it in insurance or whatever?
Well, I was going to train to be an actuary in number 3 Lombard Street, in the heart of London. And it was very obvious that women wouldn't get on anywhere near as much, because first of all the young men who started with me wore nice suits and a tie, but I was made to wear a maroon scratchy overall. So straight away I was somewhere different. So when one of my masters from school, a language master who formed the school travel service, when he said to me, would you come and join my company and go out and plan the routes, because he took school children for the very first time into private homes onto the continent. And I said, okay. And so in May 1938, for the people who know what 38 is, I went over to France to work for someone. I managed to get an au pair job with a family who lived in Contrexéville in the Vosges Mountains, just on the borders of Germany. And it transpired it was a deputy, a member of parliament, the French parliament. And I taught his 3 children English starting in May 38. And in August 38, this man went, because he was like a territorial, he went over to Strasbourg to do his camp for the summer. And while he was there, he saw on the other side of the river, in the demilitarized zone, which really no German military should ever have been, it was full of the German army, and the river was mined, and he knew war was imminent. So I had to leave and come back home again. So that was a short-lived training.
Yeah, but you actually had been in Bonn just before the war to brush up on your German?
That was a year later.
A year later?
Well, yes, almost because we thought the war, you know, Macmillan, Chamberlain,
and
piece of paper. And so we thought we were all right. So I went to Germany the next year, only on holiday for about 3 or 4 weeks. And I was there about 2 weeks before the war started.
Gosh.
So I got back both times.
So let's get to the era of one woman's war now, and when you joined the Women's Royal Air Force.
Right.
And eventually ending up in the filter room.
That's right.
So when did it all begin for this joining up?
Well, my cousin was a pilot, and when he was killed, and my father, who was in the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War, I thought it's time I did something. And I thought I'll try and replace one of them. And I volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And I was asked right at the beginning, do you want to be a cook or a driver? And I'd been warned to say, I'd like to be a clerk special duties. I had no idea what it meant, because the person who told me said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you, it's secret. So when I said this to the woman, this officer, she nearly hit the ceiling. How do you know about it? I said, well, I've got to tell you I'm good at maths. And that was the magic word.
And you were in?
I was in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Eventually married?
Yeah.
And that was through a kind of a riding initiative, going to a gentleman who was in charge of ponies.
Yeah, well, Captain Jimmy Younghusband had the Stanmore Riding School, which was bang opposite where we worked. And I was asked to run a sort of event for Wings for Victory, to get people to save. So I put on a garden party in the grounds, and we got all sorts of prizes from the local shopkeepers. We also did events of varying sorts, and everyone who paid anything got a stamp. So it didn't cost them anything. They got a savings stamp. So I thought, well, if I asked the riding school proprietor to loan me some horses and a couple of stable girls, I can give the kids rides, and they'll pay a shilling, as it was then, and they'll get their stamp, and they'll have a ride. And that's how I met Captain Jimmy Younghusband.
I was going to say, his father had a stable of stallions, and then he had a son, but I don't know why I put that in the two in the same sentence, really. But so you married the son?
Well, I met their son,
yeah.
Just by chance, because he tried to sell me the dance orchestra from RAF Northwold.
Oh, he was doing that on the side?
He was in the physical training and entertainment side there.
Ah, right.
And he ran the station dance orchestra.
Yes.
So that's how I met him.
Now, intriguingly, when I chatted with Eileen on air, she just plucks dates out of the memory, which are quite extraordinary. Now, the filter room itself, the work in the filter room. Now, we've all seen in old films of the war and so on, you see the operations girls with their long pieces of stick moving aircraft along this table. But the filter room was something entirely different.
Yes, when I went to Bletchley Park last year, I gave a talk to them, and I asked them 3 questions. I said, how many people know about the radar chain around the outside of Great Britain? And every hand went up. How many people have seen on television the girls with the long sticks? And every hand went up. I said, how many people have ever heard of the filter room? Not a hand. And I said, how do you think all that radar information, height, identity, number of aircraft, whether it's friend or foe, with the identification that our planes had, the direction they were going, how do you think all that turned into one little thing on the end of a stick? And one man put his hand up and he said, I have thought about it, but I didn't get anywhere because it was so secret, because 30 years after the war, we were covered with the Official Secrets Act. But what we did, we assimilated, collated, and corrected all the information that the radar stations played into that central table, a map table at the filter room. Basically, it was at all the command headquarters, and Fighter Command at Stanmore was the major one. And that covered Norwich right the way around to the Isle of Wight, and Wales was covered by the one at Bath, from the Isle of Wight round to North Wales. And we would assimilate this information, turn it into an arrow going in a direction. We would estimate the correct height. We would estimate the number of aircraft. For example, one radar station would see 5+ aircraft coming in. The one over there would see 20+. The one that way might see 100+. And I would have to look at those numbers and instantly work them out. Of course, it's all done by computer now.
And you did it in your mind?
We did it instantly, on the table, all hands being pushed over this table, high frenzy, everyone speaking, repeating what they'd heard to make certain they got it correct. On the balcony, the controller identifying it, make it a hostile, make it a fighter, make it a bomber, and that information was then told by another girl speaking received English, because you couldn't have an accent, unfortunately, in case there was a delay. And she would say, stand by, new track, hostile, 5370, 15+ at 20,000, in Willie Victor, 7340. And that was how that little thing ended up on the end of that stick.
And in the latter years of the war, we're moving on now to the flying bombs. First of all, the V1 came off a ramp, and then the V2, which was the early version of a clear rocket.
That's right.
And you had to plot these as well?
Well, we plotted the V1s quite easily because they were like aircraft going on a predestined course. And the V1s went as far as there was fuel. When the fuel finished, they dropped. So they were easily picked up. The V2 was different. It had a trajectory, it was launched, it took under 4 minutes to land, so you didn't have much time to do much. And when they were landing on Britain, they'd landed before we would ever have had you could pick up the top of the curve by radar. And when you knew the fall of shot, you could have extrapolated the curve to see where it came from. And that's all we did. And someone like Raymond Baxter, who was flying Spitfires then, he used to go and bombard the launch sites.
Which were lorries, really?
No, they weren't. They were ramps.
What, not the V2s?
Yes, the V2s were initially from ramps in France. But once the Germans were in retreat, they did them with a lorry and a trailer. And they would go out in the woods or wherever, because by then they had to go farther away. So it didn't always reach as far. So it only reached Norfolk, for example. And then eventually they stopped bombing Britain, but they bombed Antwerp. And Antwerp had more V2s on it than London, 500 more, because it was our first clean port.
Right. Well, I've watched One Woman's War on the DVD, and that's available as well. It's quite extraordinary. And what was the date of the first V2 landing? The
first V2 was September the 8th, 1944.
See? For heaven's sake. I couldn't believe it when it was on it. It's quite
I hope no one's going to check that up, but I'm sure it's right.
Dear, oh dear. So there we are. It's extraordinarily interesting. 55 minutes. That's all it takes. There we are. Narrated by Drew Mackenzie.
Yeah.
Now then, let's get to today's launch. Men I Have Known.
Yeah.
Now, we won't go in any order. We'll just pluck them out of your memory.
Right.
And one colourful one in particular, in all kinds of ways, was Idi Amin.
Yes.
And you knew him from early days?
I don't know that I would say I knew him. 7 days he came into the hotel we ran in Wiltshire. He was a major then.
Right.
And it was at the time when the School of Infantry in Wiltshire were training all the foreign armies. It was amazing. All these different armies would come, go on the Salisbury Plain, and our hotel was on the north side. And they asked if they could come and set up hay boxes. Those of you who are Girl Guides and Boy Scouts will know what a hay box is. And there would be curry for them all. And they set it up in front of the hotel, and then they could come in and buy a glass of beer or whatever. And we had all these different people. And one whole week, Idi Amin came in every single day. And it was a very low ceiling with lots of wooden beams. And he was an enormous, great, brawny man. And he hit his head on the beam the very first time he came in and swore profusely. He treated me as if I was absolute dirt. He treated everyone that way. The private, the British private who brought him his curry was just treated in the same way. He was really, really very arrogant. But it's quite interesting. My cousin who's here today tells me that he flew him when he was a boxer, because when he was a sergeant in the army, he was a famous boxer.
That's right.
And I don't think he was any better then.
Well, Mao Tse-tung, leader of China, he was what they purported to be some kind of Olympic Games in China.
Really?
He won every event.
Did he?
Yeah. There were some waiting and arrangements made about the others as well, but he won every event. And also Winston Churchill, of course.
Yes.
You met Winston Churchill?
Well, Winston Churchill used to come in to the balcony, looking over the filter room whenever anything was interesting, because he had a room in Fighter Command headquarters at the same time as Air Chief Marshal Stuffy Dowding, who was the one who had the Dowding system, which was the way radar was used. And the two of them would be working together, of course. And whenever there was anything interesting, he'd come in. He'd always have a cigar in his mouth, never lighted, but he still had his cigar there. And he would call down things of encouragement, not very much, but he'd say, well done, if he were there pretty well near when it got quiet.
Right.
I have a great respect for Winston Churchill.
Cat-size Cunningham?
Cat-size Cunningham. Cat-size Cunningham, when pilots had done a certain number of sorties, they went on relief. And when I was at 10 Group, in Bath, they sent them to the headquarters, and they would come into the filter room and learn what we were doing in order to give them really confidence in knowing that the filter room was actually tracking them. And if they even landed in the sea, we'd send the SC Rescue out for them. And because it was a mixed mess, we would see him every evening. We would probably have dinner with him sometimes. And of course, when these boys were relaxing, they got up to all sorts of weird games. And he and Mortimer Rose, they used to have, they'd run up and down the mess and then dive over the bar counter through the hatchway. All the pilots used to do this. Why, I don't know, but they did. They were happy when they got through all right.
You remind me, I once went on a course with the Council of Europe in a place called Danaue-Schingen, which is in Bavaria, and the Danube is supposed to rise there, and it was a German-based course. And we had a Professor Manfred Pohl on the course. And when he'd had a few drinks, he would go running down the street shouting, "Regroup, regroup, regroup." And when we said, what are you doing, regrouping? He said, well, when we were bombing London, he said, we'd look out the window for other aircraft on our way home, and we'd say over Dover, regroup, regroup. So it was quite extraordinary. And he had this kind of memory and past experience as well.
Yeah.
What about, you mentioned radar. Watson Watt, then, of radar fame?
Well, yes, well, Watson Watt, of course, was the man who invented it all and how it was used, of course, with other scientists' help. And when I trained to be a filter officer, that was three months after I enrolled as an ordinary filter and plotter, I was sent down to Bordsey, where all the inventions were done of radar, and he would come in and explain things to us. Wonderful man, but quite not sociable, very professional and always very efficient. Mm.
Let's sidestep a little then away from the military men here and go to, well, a man, a thespian, if you like, Rex Harrison.
Oh, yes. Well, he was in the Air Force too. Mm. He was an air raid warnings officer, and he was at 10 Group with me. And he was a very strange man, very superior. And because it was a mixed mess, we might all be on night watch together, and he would join us after night watch for breakfast. Mm. I was never attracted to Rex Harrison in any way because he had pretty horrible table manners. He'd chew his toast and it would all ooze out of the side of his mouth. So it put me off a bit.
Is it? It's like Clark Gable. Apparently he always clicked his false teeth and had terrible halitosis as well. God. Yes. And yet, when he took his shirt off in Gone with the Wind and had no vest on, the sales of vests in America dropped by 80%. So then, writers too. Alfred Noyes, I notice here, author of the famous poem, The Highwayman.
Oh, yes. Well, I've always loved poetry, and poetry was the first thing I ever wrote. Not that you could ever publish poetry, but I love poetry. And I also used to declaim it. The wind was a torrent of darkness among the gusty trees, The Highwayman, right, which was Alfred Noyes' famous poem. And when we ran the Winter Gardens at Ventnor, we used to do a free concert for the sort of the older people when they were there, you know, when it was a sort of older people's week. And they were short of an act. So I said, oh, I'll go up and say The Highwayman. So I stood on this stage and recited The Highwayman. Fortunately, I didn't make any mistakes. And afterwards, out of the audience, an old gentleman came with a stick and wandered up. He said, that's the first time I've ever heard my poem recited. And it was Alfred Noyes. He'd never heard it recited before.
Yes.
And he lived on the Isle of Wight at St. Lawrence. Oh. And later on, I met his son, and we had coffee together, and he presented me with a photocopy of the handwritten Highwayman with all the alterations of his father on it.
Good heavens.
Which I treasure.
Yeah. And then there was Henry Williamson of Tarker the Otter.
Oh, well, yes, well, I cleaned his bath for him. That was when I had a hotel in North Devon.
You were a hotelier then?
Well, we became hoteliers. We fell into that. We got, you know, because after the war, I couldn't go back to the city, and because I was married with a child, and women didn't do that. My husband was training in filming, and there were no films being made. So we fell into hotels. but because a relative asked us to run one. And down in Devon, there was a man called Ronnie Duncan who used to write for the Evening News, and I think it was called Jan Stewart, and it was all in Devon dialect. And he rang me up one day and he said, can you send one of your staff down? My wife's gone away and I've got this famous poet coming to stay with me and I've got to have his bath cleaned. Well, all my staff had gone home, so I said, oh, I'll come and do it. So I went down and that's how I met him.
Gosh,
yes.
And
I said, as long as you introduce me to this wonderful man, because I've loved the story of Tarka the Otter. And I met him, and he'd come down to do some shooting. And my husband was a very keen shot. So I put the two of them together, and he was told the good spots to go. And I think he got a couple of pheasants, and he was thrilled to bits about that. But he was a lovely man.